Hi, Martin Road friends. Today we're going to start reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, written by Roald Dahl, one of my favorite authors of all time. I bet if you go online, you'll be able to find some books that were written by Roald Dahl that you might be interested in reading as well. As we go through the story, Mrs. Radon is going to talk about some of the strategies that we have been learning throughout the year. Strategies such as rereading, visualizing, stopping to think about what you're reading, asking questions, or maybe even looking for those sneaky context clues to help you figure out a word that you don't know. All right, let's begin. Let's start with chapter 1. And chapter 1 is called Here Comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And here they are. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket. This is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. Here are the grandparents and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket. And here is Charlie. The whole of the family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and little Charlie Bucket lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only one bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired, they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon mattresses on the floor. This might be a good time to stop and think about what I've read. So far it looks like Charlie Bucket lives with his parents and his grandparents. He has 2 sets of grandparents. They live in a very small house that was extremely uncomfortable, and the grandparents shared one bed, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and Charlie Bucket slept in mattresses on the floor. So that's giving me clues and hints that they must be very poor. Let's continue reading. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. So we were right, very poor. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money. And poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy half the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a little bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible, empty feeling in their tummies. Oh, dear. Charlie felt it worst of all. And although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. So, wait a minute. Let me get this straight. Maybe I need to reread that paragraph because it sounds like maybe there's a chocolate store on his way to school. Let's reread and see if we can figure that out. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he could stop and stare and press his nose. Okay, so there's shop windows, there's chocolate in there, so it must be some kind of candy shop. Many times a day, he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily. And that, of course, was pure torture. Well, why was that pure torture for Charlie? Why wasn't he able to get creamy candy bars? I don't know. Maybe if we read on, we'll find out. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. Once a year on his birthday? That's it? That is pure torture. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat by himself, and each time he received it on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned, and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never touch it. Then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of paper at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely, sweet taste spread out slowly over his tongue. Ooh, I could almost taste it myself, can you? The next day, he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make his 10-cent bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching creamy candy bars right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine. And it was this. Oh my goodness, what is it? Well, in the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. And it must be enormous because I don't know if you could see this, but it says enormous chocolate factory in big letters. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there ever has been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Lots of describing words in there. Tremendous, marvelous, belching smoke, whizzing sounds. Lots of very good describing words. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, Little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly. And he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. And oh, how he wished he could go inside that factory and see what it was like. I want to go in that factory. How about you? Chapter 2, Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. Meet me again here on the YouTube channel, and we will read Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory, Chapter 2. Boys and girls, make sure you're reading every day. It will take you to places that you never thought you could go. Bye.